We're up to chapter 1, Mishnah 17. And I'll read the Mishnah and give a little backstory of who we're talking about and then try to understand some of the lessons of the Mishnah. Shimon ben אומר, Shimon, his son, says, this is the son of Rabban Gamliel, who was the author of the previous Mishnah. Yimiy, Gdalti ben החכמים, all my days I have been raised amongst the sages. מצאתי לגוף טוב אלא שתיקה, and I have found nothing as good for the body as silence. המדרש הוא העיקר אלא המעשה, and the study is not the main thing, but practice is the main thing. And anyone who talks excessively, מביא המרבה, דברים, מביא. Whoever talks excessively brings sin. It's a really interesting collection of teachings we find from this Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel. Now, we're going back now to the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. This individual, Rabban Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel, is a direct descendant of Hillel, and he is the Nasi, the president of the Jewish people, at a very volatile time in Jewish history. He becomes the Nasi at the year 52 of the Common Era. At the time, Israel is controlled by the Romans. And the Romans, of course, have been very brutal to us in our history, but they're only 20 years or so before this tremendous conflagration that's going to consume all of Judea, and amongst it, the destruction of the temple. And this Rabban Shimon, in fact, is going to be one of the people who the Romans select to assassinate, because he's like the leader of the Jewish people. But at the time that he's appointed to become the Nasi, to take over for his father, it's 18 years before the destruction, and the temple is still standing, and there still is a Sanhedrin, there still is a Supreme Court of the Jewish nation in Jerusalem. Now, it's not in the temple anymore. It already left the temple grounds, moved to a different neighborhood in Jerusalem. But it's still there. They're still judging capital punishment cases. Like there still is a Jewish sovereignty to a certain degree over the land. Now, the Romans initially, when they came to Israel, they developed a policy of allowing the Jews to self-govern. They would appoint like a puppet, who's like a king or a procurator or a proconsul, someone who was in charge of the local people, but they have to answer up to their higher-ups in Rome. And they had a policy, in fact, that what they used to do is they would take the sons of those proxy leaders and raise them in Rome. And the idea is we're grooming your children to be your successors in the ways of Rome. But really it was a veiled threat. If you play any shtick, if you try to coordinate some sort of revolt against us, we have your kids here hostage. Now, the earlier ones were Antipater and, of course, Herod. But at this time, the Romans already, the Jews are rebelling. The Jews are causing all kinds of problems. A lot of crime in Israel and Judea. And therefore, the Romans decided to take over direct rule, which was very unique at that time in history. This is the middle of the Roman Empire. This is the era called Pax Romana. There's peace amongst the various far-flung parts of the Roman Empire, but Judea is a hot spot. And it's going to really rise a notch in the 60s, and it's going to erupt with a great revolt, leading, of course, to the siege of Jerusalem and the horrific destruction of the city and really of the hopes of the Jewish nation, at least temporarily, and of course, the temple. But at the time that the author of this Mishnah was appointed, the temple was still standing. And the Talmud gives us a few interesting stories about him and his leadership. We don't really know so much about him, but we know a little bit about him. For example, there's this interesting anecdote that we're told in the Talmud, the book of Sukkah, of how he would behave during the holiday of Sukkot, of Sukkot. Now, the Torah tells us that there's 3 times a year that we have to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Of course, Jews ideally should live in Israel maybe even lived close to Jerusalem. But of course, there's Jews living in the north part of Israel, Jews living in the south, and already the whole Second Temple era, there's Jews living in Babylon and in Persia and all kinds of places, Asia Minor. Jews are spread out. But there was these several times a year that all the Jews were encouraged, and it's a mitzvah, to appear before God in the temple, to bring sacrifices, and to have this touch point with the Jewish nation. The whole nation comes together several times a year. It's just you meet your cousins, and you get together, and you go to the temple, and if you made any pledges, you fulfill your pledges, because the temple was a bastion of charity. Everyone, if you're living in Asia Minor, and you want to make a pledge to the temple, you make a pledge to the temple. You say, I'm going to give a donation to the temple because that's the charity of the Jewish people. And then you wait until the pilgrimage. You go with your family, you travel, you have these big caravans going to Jerusalem, and you go there during one of the holidays, and you bring these offerings or donations that you had pledged over the course of the preceding months and years. So there was an especially momentous celebration every year during the holiday of Sukkot. It was called Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which means literally the joy of the house of Shoeva means to draw, like you draw water from the well. And it was this a celebration? And of course, this is coming on the heels of Yom Kippur. Right after Yom Kippur, all the Jews, all our sins are expunged. They're all absolved. We're free of sin. And therefore, we celebrate the holiday of Sukkot, which is, its nickname is Zman Simchasenu, the time of our joy. Everyone's joyous. Everyone's happy. Everyone's upbeat. Everyone's positive because now we're free of sin. And they come to the temple and they celebrate. And they would have parties every night. And they would draw prophecy. There was a wellspring of spiritual power and energy available in the temple when the whole nation is there together. On the heels of Yom Kippur, everyone was able to draw prophecy. And they would have celebrations. And the Talmud says that Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel, when he was together with everyone, he would juggle 8 torches of fire to celebrate. If you have the greatest leader of the people, he goes into the center. You can imagine, maybe you could try to visualize this, in the temple, the beautiful, stunning temple that was refurbished recently by Herod. In the center, all the Jews are dancing, there's music playing, and then the great rabbi, who's also the direct descendant of King David, who's essentially the Jewish king, gets up, pulls out 8 torches, and starts juggling them all in the air. Pretty cool. Just a nice description into the kind of world that he begins his reign. There's another amazing story brought down in the Mishnah about, I think it shows a little bit of his leadership qualities. Because in Judaism, the leader is viewed not just by their own personal accomplishments and abilities, but specifically how they treat their underlings, how they treat the people that they are in control of. And not just the people in the high society, but specifically people who are of the lower social strata. And the way the great person treats those people is really how they're viewed as a leader. And the Talmud says that we know that there's various offerings and sacrifices that are when the temple is extant, temple standing. There are sacrifices that are optional, and there are sacrifices that are mandatory. So, for example, there's a communal sacrifice every morning and every afternoon. It's the first sacrifice in the morning and the last sacrifice in the late afternoon. It's called the Tamid, and that is brought from the coffers of the whole temple of the whole Jewish nation. And that's mandatory. And there's mandatory sacrifices on Shabbos and on festivals, etc. And then there are personal sacrifices that are optional. If you want to just thank God, you make a celebration. You invite all your friends, you bring a sacrifice, a little bit goes on the altar, a little bit goes to the Kohen, a little bit goes to the Levite, a little bit goes to your friends. It's just a nice experience, and it's optional. You choose you want to do it, you choose, if you want to do it, great. If not. And of course, there's many, we're in the book of Leviticus now, we know there's many different kinds of sacrifices. Now, there's one sacrifice that a woman brings after she has a baby. That's mandatory. And there's other sacrifices as well that are similar to that. When a woman has a certain illness, and she's healed from the illness, she brings a sacrifice. So the story goes that these birds that were used for these sacrifices started getting very pricey. And Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel, he wanted to stop and intervene, like this poor people, poor women, the expenses of having a baby, as we know, it's expensive. It was expensive then. And on top of that, they would have to pay exorbitant fees for these birds. And there was such a demand for these birds. Maybe there was a population boom that the supply was constricted, and the people who sold them were making enormous hikes in the price, and it became prohibitively expensive to purchase these animals. So he came up with a solution. He comes into the temple, he goes where the Sanhedrin is sitting, or he goes to visit the Sanhedrin, and he tells them, I'm not going to sleep until I cut the price by 100-fold. And he says, what do we do? And they came up with a loophole that said that if a person has, let's say, 4 or 5 different reasons to bring one sacrifice, it used to be they would bring 4 different sacrifices. But they found a halachic grounds to be able to give one sacrifice that would cover them all. And they made a new edict. From now on, we're going with this policy. And that, of course, cut the demand drastically. And by the time you went to sleep that night, the price was indeed cut 100-fold, which I think is an interesting thing. It gives us a little bit of an insight and a window into what Jewish leaders, the greatest Jewish leaders that we've had, how they operate and what are they thinking about. They're not thinking about the relationships with the other high society. They're thinking about how can I use my office and my power and my responsibilities to help those that are least fortunate. There is a Hasidic sect called the Ger sect. They're from a part of Poland called Ger, and they were founded. This great Hasidic movement was founded in the early parts of the 19th century. Some of the great Hasidic masters were from the family and from the dynasty of the Ger Hasidim. Now, I don't know the exact details, but I know that every different Hasidic group has their own distinct way of dressing. Now, maybe for us, they all look the same. They all have the long payas and the beards, but there's differences. The different size hats and different shapes and different this and different socks and whatnot. But the Gerers, the Ger Hasidim, they wear what's called a spudik, which is more of like a vertical kind of hat as opposed to like the fur hats that they wear on top of their heads. It's not as much horizontal. It's not as broad, but it's more taller. Now, the story goes is that the Gerers, they were having a problem because the price of the spudiks were going up. And one of the Rebbes, I don't know who it was, but there's a famous story. One of the Ger Rebbes said, okay, if the price goes above $1,000, the second it goes above $1,000, I'm taking off my spudik, and all of the Ger Hasidim will stop and take off theirs as well. And he managed to kind of an example of this attitude of Jewish leaders. He says, okay, if you want to gouge the customers, you're going to lose them all. And I think until this day, this was a long time ago, until this day, like the price does not creep above $1,000. It's maybe $995. It's close because, of course, these are like fur hats that are very expensive, but it's within reason. And it's an interesting idea of how we look at our leaders and how we measure them by how they tend to the needs of the real people under their charge. Now, this Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel, he is known as one of the 10 martyrs. There was a very challenging, chaotic, painful, disruptive period in Jewish history, sometime from the 60s to the 130s. And that's because the Romans were very, very harsh to the Jewish people. It began in the year 66. There was the Great Revolt. The Jews revolted against the Roman leadership because it was being very unfair. It wasn't providing any protection to the Jewish subjects. There was very harsh and punitive taxation, and they were goading essentially the Jews to revolt. And the Jews revolted. They thought maybe they would win, maybe like the Hasmonean revolt of several hundred years prior. Regardless, they were not successful. After a 4-year war, the Romans were systematically eliminating one Jewish town after another. Finally, they laid siege to Jerusalem. There's the famous story of Vespasian, the general, who becomes emperor, and his son Titus takes over and he completes the job. We meet the story of the last holdout in Masada, a group of Jews hiding in the desert plateau, holding out against their Roman conquerors. But really, like, this war killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And the Romans were going up against professional soldiers. They were going up mostly against civilians. The Jews were not even professional soldiers. They fought a guerrilla war. And that really stamped a lot of the vigor out of our nation, but the Jews rebuilt. And 30, 40, 50 years later, you have the Emperor Hadrian and the Emperor Trajan. And they, again, institute very harsh decrees and edicts and punishments against their Jewish subjects. And of course, Hadrian goes on a rampage in the 130s that leads to the Bar Kokhba revolt, another revolt, where the Jews indeed were successful in conquering Judea back from the Romans. But that only lasted for several years. The Romans came back with really harsh battles and conquests that again rivaled the conquests of Judea of 50 years prior, both in scope and in number of casualties for the Jews. But in the Talmud talks about the 10 martyrs. There were 10 great sages during this period, from the 60s to the 130s, great rabbis who were assassinated in very horrific manner by the Romans. The very first one, the very first great rabbi who was killed, one of the 10 martyrs, was Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel. And in fact, every year on Yom Kippur, during the Musaf prayer, there is an ode to these giants, these 10 martyrs, and essentially we're lobbying God, forgive us for our sins in the merit of these great sages who were each killed because of their Torah knowledge. And that, of course, is a great merit for the Jewish people. When people die, al Kiddush Hashem, they die to sanctify God's name, we try to invoke that as much as possible. Of course, the great Rabbi Akiva, he was killed in the year, I think, 136 or 135, somewhere in that era. He's also considered one of the 10 martyrs, but that began in the year 70 or so with Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel. And in fact, the Talmud brings a very emotional, dramatic story. They kidnapped and they brought to assassinate the 2 leaders of the Jewish people. Who were they? Number 1, the Nasi, the president. Number 2, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, whose name was Rabban Yishmael. Whose name was Rabbi Yishmael. And the story goes that each one of them is lobbying to die first, because they don't want to see their friend, their colleague die as well. And in the end, they threw lots, they casted lots, and Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel was killed, and they killed him very horrifically. However, as we are wont to do, the Jewish nation don't just keel over and die. Maybe the Romans expected that to happen, but that did not happen. The Jews rebuilt. His son, whose name was Rabban Gamliel, he took over, and the Jewish people lived on. Now, he's telling us in our Mishnah some interesting ideas, particularly about the idea of silence. So he has 3 clauses in the Mishnah. First of all, he tells us that he inspected everything, and all his days he grew up amongst the sages, and the best thing he found is silence. That's the first clause. And the final clause is that lots of talking, excessive talking, brings to sin. So just as a general idea, this is a theme that we see throughout Jewish writing, the virtue of silence in general. So for example, Adam. So Adam is unique. Adam is special. Adam is noteworthy. Why? Well, what distinguishes Adam, humanity, from the rest of the animals? There's no animal that's our size that can rip us to shreds. Like, physically, we're a pretty mediocre animal. What makes us different is the fact that we're intellectually more capable, and we're verbally capable as well. And there's a verse that we read in the beginning of Genesis where it talks about God infusing a soul into Adam, and Adam became a living being. What does that mean? What is this distinguishing accomplishment of Adam, that he became a living? So the commentaries tell us, notably the Targum says, that he became a speaking being. The fact that we could speak, that we could engage in verbal communication, and we could collaborate, that is almost the fundamental human characteristic. And it's interesting. When we're talking about the soul and how great our soul is, it's connected to our power of speech. And this is an interesting thing. We find this again many times throughout Jewish thought, this connection of the Jewish, of human soul with human speech. And what this is telling us is that our highest and greatest power and ability, our soul, that is linked to our speech. That's exhibited in our speech. And what that means is that it's the most powerful tool that we have. And perhaps we can even say that when my grandfather used to say this, he says, there's a representative of our soul in our body. What's the ambassador, the soul's ambassador to our body? That's our power of speech. That's when we're speaking. We're not engaging only in a physical activity, moving our mouth and our lips and our tongue and our guttural. We're actually invoking our soul. And that kind of upgrades the role of speech in our thought, or how we should think about it. And as a general principle, because it's our soul that's being manifest in our speech, it makes a lot of sense to be told that we should use it wisely, and we should even use it sparingly. If this is your soul, you don't want to sully your soul by talking all kinds of nonsense, because what you're doing is you're taking your soul, which is from the world of angels, is from the world of God, and you're talking about just mundane stuff. That is a degradation of the soul, which is an interesting idea. It's not just, let's avoid speaking bad things. Of course we should avoid speaking bad things. But silence is more than just the absence of talking. It is a virtue on its own because it is acknowledging the power of words and what really is, what part of man as in mankind, is exhibited, is brought forward with speech. And, we have in this week's Parsha, there's a story of Aaron's two sons. So this week's Parsha is Parsha Shmini, and it talks about the inauguration of the Mishkan. So in the book of Exodus, we're told, Moshe is told by the Almighty, build a tabernacle, and we're going to have a place for God to dwell in this world. Finally, the tabernacle is built on the 7 days of inauguration. This is the 8th day. This is the kickoff of the temple. And everyone's the whole nation is buzzing. Amazing. We're going to have God amongst us. And amidst this ecstasy, this joy, a terrible tragedy happens. Aaron's two sons, his oldest sons, these are the heir apparents of Moshe and Aaron. They decide that they want to bring a sacrifice. But they bring a sacrifice that's a foreign sacrifice that God doesn't want. And they go into the tabernacle, and streams of fire come down from heaven and consume their soul from when they kill them. And you can imagine the status of the nation. These are the next great leaders of the Jewish people, and they die, shockingly, without any warning. And the Torah really points out what Aaron's response was. Aaron was silent. He was quiet. And Rashi tells us that as a result of his silence, because he accepted God's judgment without question, therefore, God said, I'm going to speak to you directly. It doesn't happen. God speaks to Moshe. Sometimes God speaks to Moshe and Aaron. But to my knowledge, to my recollection, this is the only time that God speaks directly to Aaron alone. Why did Aaron deserve such an honor of being the vessel to teach Torah to the Jewish people in this one law? Because he was silent. Now, I think there's a deep point here. Silence, when someone doesn't say anything, why don't they say anything? It's because they're unsure, they're uncertain. They don't have a conviction about what is right and what is wrong, about what is really going on. And I think this is an interesting idea. It's acknowledging, Aaron is acknowledging by his silence that he doesn't know why God did what happened, but he's not questioning it either. And this is maybe the pinnacle of a relationship between a creator with the Almighty and us. It's when we realize that God's calculations are unfathomable to us, that should immediately result in our silence. Because if it's beyond you, if it's unfathomable to you, if it's way more advanced than you could possibly even dream of understanding, well, then what do you have? You have nothing. You have silence. But the silence in itself, that demonstrates this bond between creator and a person. It demonstrates that the person is accepting and acknowledging that God is in control and God has very advanced, infinitely advanced calculations. And thus, again, this is a general principle that we see, that silence is lauded as a virtue because silence shows that the person is accepting the fact that God exists and God is omnipotent, which is another principle that we see again. In addition, I want to read to you just a line that I saw from my grandfather's writings that I thought was so powerful about silence being the ability to experience. He writes, I'm just translating it directly from Hebrew. Whomever does not know the craft of silence does not have the ability to have experiences. He could see things and hear things that are beautiful and are deep and are profound and should really be awe-inspiring. But he's not inspired. He's not moved. And he has to speak. And he says, this is really nice. This is beautiful. This is good. This is okay. These things did not enter his heart like venom. Because if it did, he'd be silent. What he's writing over here is that for things to really penetrate, if they really penetrate, and you really experience, whatever it is, you really experience something, then you don't talk. And I was thinking just like how our society, like if someone goes on a trail somewhere in Utah, a really beautiful place, and everywhere they're going, take picture selfies or going straight to Instagram or whatever, but they don't just sit and absorb what they're encountering. It's kind of in one ear and out one other. It's in one pathway and out the other. It doesn't really, they're not really experiencing what they are observing, which I think is an interesting idea, principle again, about the value of silence. Now, another thing, and I think this is a little bit of a sophisticated point. Humans don't, as a general rule, this is, maybe you want to disagree with me, but my assessment is, I think that humans don't realize the amount of ability that they already have. Just how powerful their brain is. And I think that silence, when someone is silent about an idea, a concept, a thing, an experience, and they chew it over and they ruminate upon it, and they don't immediately blurt things out. They allow things to percolate within them. They allow their mind to engage with something. I think that really taps or untaps amazing abilities that people don't even know they had. And I think another, as a general, before we get to our Mishnah, a general value of silence is that it allows us to deepen our own ability that we have within ourselves in whatever we're doing. We have a tendency, maybe even an urge, to right away jump to conclusions and to give our assessment And if someone asks a question, let's blurt out an answer. First thing comes to your head, which is valuable. It's good to have snap decision-making ability. You shouldn't have to think about everything so deeply. But that is always going to limit, it's going to cap our ability, as a general rule, to be limited to a very shallow part of our mind. However, if you take a question or a problem and you spend an hour really thinking about it silently, you're actually digging into your more powerful and profound abilities to engage with issues. And that deep work is actually going to be very much exhibited in your conclusions and your outcomes from whatever it is you're encountering. Just another idea. So what does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says that this great rabbi, who was the son of the Nasi, who himself was the Nasi, a direct descendant of Hillel, whose son himself, he was the son, and his son after him was also the Nasi. This is someone who's in the upper echelons of the Jewish nation. And his whole life he spent among the sages. The most incredibly gifted on one hand, but also accomplished people, consummate people of his time. And he assessed all the virtues, and the one thing that he found the best is silence. What this is telling us is that this everything that we've spoken about till now, just the power that silence has. And I saw the Maharal, one of the commentaries, he said something very interesting. He says that when you are speaking, it's not exclusively your intellect that's operating. Yes, of course, your intellect needs to guide your words, but it's also mixed in your physicality that's at play. This is, again, another idea that's off topic, but that speech is the intersection of intellect and physicality. To speak, it's a hybrid of spiritual and physical. That's a general idea. But what he's saying is that it's not entirely spiritual. It's not entirely intellectual. And therefore, what he writes is that when you're speaking, you're actually cutting off part of your spiritual pores, your spiritual powers. Your intellectual abilities are actually shut down because you cannot operate the intellect and the physical simultaneously. Either the physical is operating or the spiritual is operating within you. You can both operate simultaneously. And therefore, with speech, because it's not entirely spiritual, it's partly physical. Therefore, you're actually, whenever you open your mouth, you're locking out a little bit of your spiritual power that you have within them. And according to this, it's interesting. If you read the words of the Mishnah, he doesn't say that I found the best thing is silence. He says, I have not found anything as good for the body as silence. According to this, what this is telling us, according to the Maharal, what it means is that you have a body and you have a soul. And how you choose to operate, or which one of these two identities you choose to maximize or to bring to the forefront, is going to determine what kind of person you are. There could be people who are very physical, people very spiritual. And everyone really has a choice which way they want to veer. This great sage is telling us, I have found nothing better for the body than silence. According to what the Maharal is telling us, what this means is, there's nothing better for the body than to be on the sideline and to be an aid to the spiritual, to be there to service the spiritual, and not the other way around. We typically, by default, we view our body as our identity and our spiritual as something that's there to help us, to service us. What this is telling us, that's exactly the opposite. Our body is there to service our soul, not the other way around. What is the idealized location for the body? In this balance between body and soul, the body should be off to the side and to be there to help and assist and support the soul, but not to demand that the soul helps and assists and supports it. Which is a lot of very deep ideas that we're finding over here. in our life, we have two agendas. We have the agenda of our body and the agenda of our soul. And which one of them we choose to tend to and to worry about, that really determines who we are as a person. If we worry about what our body wants, and that's always at the forefront of our minds, well, okay, what does that mean about our identity? It means that we're living as a body. If we worry about our soul, if we worry about what our soul wants, and we're concerned with its agenda, then we're living like a soul. What happens when someone dies? Body's buried, soul goes to heaven. If the person chose to live like a body, well, their body's buried in the ground. How could they have an afterlife? Their body's dead. However, if they chose to live as a soul, well, the soul's still alive. And therefore, they could flourish in the spiritual world. So again, what we see here is like, what's the best thing for the body? Silence. Well, what's the best thing for the soul? Talking. Why? Because if the concerns of the soul is what you're talking about, then you are choosing to live like a soul. If the concerns of the body where you're talking about, then you choose to live like a body. And what's the best thing for the body? Silence. Right? Don't worry so much about it. You see people who do renovations in their house. Even if their house is permanent, it's not. Most people don't live in their houses for 100 years. Most people probably don't live in their houses for 50 years. So, yes, it's a permanent home, but it's just more temporary, or it's more permanent, but it's still temporary. We are our souls forever. When people choose to say, I'm going to spend a year now thinking about renovating my house, what they're doing is this. It's like your house is built in quicksand. It might as well be built in quicksand. It's temporary. If you know your house is going to collapse in a month, you don't think about, oh, should I put the painting over here or over there? Well, it doesn't matter, right? It's like that's the whole idea of the sukkah. The sukkah is the idea is that you remind yourself that our life here is temporary. So I'm going to leave my air-conditioned home and move into a little hut. This is my home now. Because really, it's the same thing. Amazing idea, we're told. Silence. That's what your body needs. Now, the last part of the Mishnah is a similar thing. It says if you talk too much, you might sin. Now, of course, all the commentaries give their own examples of how talk can lead to sin. Of course, we know that people who are chatterboxes, who love to gossip, that, of course, is one of the grave sins that a person could do, is speaking Lashon Hara. But there's many, many examples. And even someone who is, let's say, a great Torah scholar and has to render halachic decisions, so that, of course, is a mitzvah. But if you speak too much or too excessively or in a non-subtle way or too hastily, then you're at the risk of rendering the wrong halachic opinion. I want to also quickly talk about the middle clause of the Mishnah. It says not the study is what's important, but the action is what is important. So it's not just about what someone teaches or someone studies, it's about how they behave. If someone, of course, they're a big preacher, but they don't practice, we all know there's something wrong with that. You have to practice what you preach. That's, of course, a general principle. But there's an interesting statement here that the Mishnah tells us, that you have speech, and then you have study, and you have action. And what's the most important thing? The most important thing is action. And, of course, it's very, very important for us to study. But the study is not what's the ikar. It's not the thing it's not the goal. It's not the objective. The objective is the behavior. And I think this really dovetails with all the themes that we've seen previous. Who you really are as a person, that is something that is not necessarily fixed. That's dynamic. That is really what free will is. Free will is who you are as a person. Who are you? Are you an animal? Are you a body? Are you an angel? Are you a soul? Those are very different things. If I take an angel and an animal, they're the most different things that could possibly exist. We're both. We have, in our body, we're an animal. In our soul, we're an angel. And therefore, because we're conflicted, we have the ability to choose one way or the other. And thus, what really shows, what demonstrates that we're living properly as a soul, as an angel, and not as a body, as an animal? That, of course, is our behavior. Everything Torah our intellect. Everything that we got from the Almighty is there to lead us so that we behave in a certain way, the way of angels. Now, how do we know how angels behave? How am I supposed to know? I've never been an angel. That is Torah. Torah is the manual how angels live, or how you, with the angel that you have within yourself, with the soul, what is the agenda of the soul? How do I start living like the soul? Well, read the Torah, and the Torah tells you. And that's each mitzvah, each of the 613 mitzvahs is an instruction of how to behave in a given situation as a soul or as an angel. That's what Torah is. Torah is the manual to live as a soul. And that's, of course, the greatest gift that God did for us. He showed us you have the ability to live like an animal or like an angel. And, of course, the best thing for you, both in this world and in the next, is to live as an angel. But how am I supposed to know to live like an angel? From the beginning of my life, I've been wired by default to live like an animal, to live like a body, to live physically. That's where my senses lie. If someone goes 20 hours without eating, they feel grumbling in their stomach. If someone goes 20 hours or even 20 years without studying Torah, they can feel just fine. Problem is, we're bodies. We are animals. We are physical sensorially in our senses, and we're only spiritual intellectually and with a lot of hard work. Therefore, the Torah is there to guide us, to help us, to achieve the destiny of living like an angel, living like a soul. And he tells us, do this, shake a lulav. And you're like, why am I shaking a lulav? Why am I eating matzah? It doesn't make sense to you necessarily. Some of them do, but some of them don't. Why am I chewing crackers? Right? Doesn't make sense to me. And the answer is, it doesn't make sense to your body, but to your soul. It makes abundant sense. Your soul is wondering why you're sitting in front of a television. It's as befuddling to the soul why someone would choose to sit and watch television. Doesn't make any sense. The body makes tons of sense, but the soul, it's totally perplexing. Why would someone choose to do that? And there we have the answer. The answer is because we sense our body, we don't sense our soul. How do we start living more like a soul? How do we start operating more like an angel? Well, that's what Torah is there for. And here we see this again in this Mishnah, very powerful Mishnah that we see over here. Not the study is what's the ikar, what's the goal, what's the end game. The end game is the behavior. The study is there. You study Torah. It's there to teach you how to live like an angel. But living like an angel, that is indeed the goal. An incredible idea. Of course, it's not easy for us to absorb it because from a child, from the day they're born, the body has pole position. The body is the driver. The soul is, if someone acknowledges the existence of the soul, that's kind of like an abstract, theoretical idea. It's not who they are. And we think of ourselves, and this is the way the Almighty engineered us, that our first priority and our first identity is the body, and we have to undo that. And the Torah is there to undo the incumbent. The body's the incumbent. But, of course, we're taught in the Torah and the Torah's lessons that it doesn't have to be like that forever. We could change it. And indeed, we're given the manual of how to change it. And therefore, we're told here, what is the goal? The goal is the ma'ase. The goal is the action. The goal is the behavior of someone behaving as a soul. That is the goal of it all.